Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises today on the 1960s kitchen of a home in Wolverhampton. Mum is preparing for an afternoon of baking. 9-year-old Nigel is sitting reading a cookbook, Cookery in Color by Marguerite Patton, the only real cookbook in the house. This is the opening of the play Nigel Slater's Toast, written by Henry Filloux-Bennett as a lovingly edited dramatization of Nigel Slater's award-winning memoir about his childhood that was published in 2003. The play premiered at the Lowry Theatre in Manchester in 2018, before a sold-out run at the Travers in Edinburgh that summer, followed by a 4-month run at the Other Palace Theatre in London and a UK tour. The play also won the Cameo Award in 2018 for the best adaptation of a stage play from a published book. Nigel's original memoir also won a number of awards, including the Andre Simon and Glenfiddich Book of the Year Awards, as well as Biography of the Year at the British Book Awards in 2004. Toast is distinguished for its distinctive form of autobiography. The child's perspective leaves out much of the usual background detail about the other people in his life and focuses instead on his emotional relationships with food and the people closest to him, his mother, father, and stepmother. It is also touchingly open and honest about his young hopes and fears, and it is written in the gloriously clear and sensuous prose that we know and love in Nigel's cookery writing. It seems, at first thought, unlikely material to turn into a drama, however, given that it is largely a sequence of mouth-watering descriptions of Nigel's favorite childhood foods. But interwoven into the culinary diary is the not undramatic story of Nigel's life as it unfolds. And it is the subtle way that these life-changing events are related through the lens of Nigel's childhood preoccupations that give the book and the play its narrative structure and emotional substance. That doesn't, of course, answer the more challenging question of how you create a three-dimensional theatrical experience out of a compendium of beautiful prose descriptions of food. But we'll come to that. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the podcast today what I think it is most accurate to say are the two authors of this play, both Henry and Nigel. Before we jump in, I must do proper introductions. Nigel Slater, OBE, is the presenter of 9 BBC television series and the author of a collection of best-selling books, including the classics Appetite, 2 volumes of Tender, as well as the Kitchen Diaries trilogy. Nigel's most recent book, Green Feast, was published in 2 parts in 2019, Green Feast Spring-Summer and Green Feast Autumn-Winter. Many of us know Nigel best for his much-loved weekly cookery column, which he has written for The Observer for the past 27 years. It is the combination of his sharing realistic recipes that we believe we ourselves can make with a prose that is full of his love of the tangible experience of food that is so captivating. Although he's very much a consummate professional as program maker, columnist, and author, he says that he's not a professional chef. In his own words, he remains very much an amateur cook, although personally, I think that rather undersells him. He believes there is something quietly civilizing about sharing a meal with other people. The simple act of making someone something to eat, even a bowl of soup or a loaf of bread, has a many-layered meaning. It suggests an act of protection and caring, of generosity and intimacy. It is in itself a sign of respect. It is perhaps this understanding of the emotional connection between food and people that is the source of the unique form of this memoir and this play, Toast. Henry Filloux-Bennett is a theatre person through and through. He's worked for organizations including the Lowry, Bill Kenwright, Theatre Royal Haymarket, the Royal Shakespeare Company, Nottingham Playhouse, and the High Tide Festival, as well as having produced independently. From 2010 to 2012, he was artistic director of the Old Red Lion Theatre in London, during which time the theatre enjoyed a West End transfer and a transfer off Broadway. As a writer, Henry's first play, Wasted, was produced at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and was picked as a critic's choice by The Spectator. He subsequently wrote the world premiere stage adaptation of Evelyn Waugh's Decline and Fall, which was produced at the Old Red Lion, before writing Nigel Slater's Toast in 2018. In 2019, he joined the Lawrence Batley Theatre in Huddersfield as chief executive and artistic director. And most recently, he wrote The Understudy, based on the novel by David Nichols, which was adapted as an online play broadcast by the theatre to raise funds for the theatre industry, and starring Stephen Fry, Russell Tovey, Sarah Hadland, and Sheila Aitum. Henry and the Lawrence Batley Theatre continue their innovative response to the challenge of the COVID crisis with an online adaptation of Nigel Slater's Toast, which is available via the theatre website until the 31st of July. So that's the formal introductions. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. My first question is to you, Henry, which is, what was it originally about Nigel's memoir that made you think it could be turned into a play?
First of all, this is incredibly weird. I've never actually had to answer questions about Toast in front of Nigel, so this is a bit nerve-wracking. So I read it a fairly long time ago when I was working in a kitchen in London. I would read it on the bus. I lived a long way outside of London, and I would read it on the bus to and from work. And I, at that point, wanted to get into theatre. I thought I wasn't quite sure how I'd do it, but I had these grand ideas of how Toast would definitely become a stage play, and it would have a huge amount of success. I'm not quite sure why I thought it particularly should live on stage. I think the thing for me was the tastes and the smells, and obviously I wasn't aware at that point that it was being considered for a TV film, but in my mind at least, the most honest and authentic way of getting across the story of Nigel's growing up was to share those smells and tastes with an audience, and you do that through your stage play. So that was I think that was my route into it. It was probably also the fact that it resonated so much with me in terms of that little boy growing up, not really knowing what his place in the world would be, dealing with isolation, dealing with loneliness. And I think those sorts of things resonated, as well as an amazing, beautiful relationship with a mother character. I think those things made me want to turn it into some sort of experience for an audience.
So you mentioned you were working in a kitchen. Were you an aspiring cook as well, or chef?
Yeah, I was until I got into theatre, I was going to be in cooking. So I at that point, I was working at Claridge's in the hotel kitchens, and then I went to Gordon Ramsay at Claridge's, then moved over to Royal Hospital Road. And so I was working there when I was reading Toast.
Well, so it obviously spoke to you from that point of view as well. Nigel, I mean, I'm not quite sure when this idea first came to you, but I gather that Henry was quite persistent about the idea. What did you think of the idea of turning Toast into a play?
I really wasn't sure about it. It had worked as a memoir, and it had worked as a film. The idea that it would also find a home on stage, and I suppose because theatre wasn't my world at that time, I couldn't quite see how it would translate onto the stage. And then, initially I said no, and I think I may have said no a few more times as well. And none of it, of course, having seen a word of Henry's play. And then I'm not quite sure how my agent got hold of some of it, but she did. And you really ought to see this. I think you should see it. I'm still reluctant, partly because I felt a certain ownership of it. And the idea that somebody I didn't know, I'd never met, was coming in, I felt almost slightly on my territory. If anyone was going to do it, it was going to be me, having, of course, no idea how difficult it was. So she sent it over, and I had a look. And it was an extraordinary moment because, yes, it was my story, this story of this little boy, but it was so sensitively done. And also, the one thing that I never wanted Toast to be was a sort of gritty, quite sad story. I always wanted there to be a lot of humour there, and the humour was there. Mm-hmm. Henry had captured that humour, and I thought, this could work. This really could. And so I gave it the green light. I think without even meeting Henry, actually, just literally from his words on the page.
Oh, that's fantastic. I can understand a certain amount of hesitation. It's a very personal story for you, obviously. Henry, what did you think, going back to the practical challenges in a sense, what did you think the main challenges for translating this memoir to the three-dimensional stage would be?
Well, I think the lucky thing is I knew they wouldn't be my challenges. That was the first easy thing. So I was incredibly fortunate in that I'd seen a play called Things I Know to Be True which was a Frantic Assembly show. I saw it at the Lyric Hammersmith, and then it came to the Lowry on tour, and I saw it probably every night of the week it was there. It's probably one of my favourite pieces of theatre that has ever been created. And in the interval, I looked at who was involved, because I knew that that style of physicality and that way of telling a story without really there being scene changes. I've never liked the idea that the lights cut out, we reset the stage, you do it again. I've always hated that sort of theatre. And I think when I looked through the credits, I saw this guy called Johnny Reardon. Actually, I was really lucky in knowing that when I was writing it, I knew exactly who would be directing it from the start. And I knew that, having seen Things I Know to Be True, you know, that man can just make magic happen on stage. And that was incredibly liberating, because I didn't have to imagine much. And I think the genius of having someone like Johnny involved in it, rather than a quote unquote traditional theatre director, because he comes from a physical theatre point of view, the joy of it was that actually the whole thing really turned into a piece of choreography. The whole thing is a piece of movement, really. And it happens to tell the story of Nigel, who very rarely goes off stage, but he's always being moved or moving things around. I think that was the main challenge. How on earth do you go from a kitchen at the Talbot to the beach in Bournemouth to the Masons in Birmingham or Wolverhampton? How do you do any of those things? The one other thing I would just say, and then I'll shut up, is that I had read an interview with Nigel where he talked about people coming together around the table being one of the most important things for him, and the idea that people can share food and that someone can provide for that group of people coming together. So that was probably the most important sense, was that we wanted people to come together somehow, and that became, let's get everyone around the kitchen table, so metaphorically. So those, I think, were the biggest challenges. Lots of locations. How do you take a boy from 7, 8 to 18, 19 in the course of 2 hours? That's nigh on impossible unless you're a film and you have multiple people playing the character. All of those things, though, Johnny had an answer for almost immediately. So I had to do nothing.
I don't believe that, but there are some lovely things in there. I think the point about the seamless changes of location or whatever is there in the original memoir as well, Nigel, because it's not conventional in the sense as, okay, in October 1972, I did this. It just flows along. And you're not even really sure at times how much time has gone by or what age you've got to, because the view that you're getting is through your eyes, very subjective. And of course, it's also interwoven with just descriptions of your world around you, the food in particular. So it has that seamlessness as a raw material as well. One of the things that strikes me so much about the play is the narrative perspective. So again, another challenge. Nigel, you wrote this as a memoir with a single narrator. How do you imagine then you reproduce this as a drama? I mean, you've seen it done as a film, I guess, but the whole story is told through your voice, right?
It is, but it's really, in many ways, written through the voice of food as much as anything. I hadn't truly realized the chronology of it. I just initially started out to catalogue the food of my childhood. The things that I probably hadn't eaten for sort of 50 years. I suppose the most important dishes of my life, plus little treats and things. What I hadn't taken on board when I was writing it was that I had also written this memoir going from the very first things I could remember making with my mother, standing in the kitchen, stirring sort of Christmas cake mixture in the bowl, right the way through till I was sort of, I think in my early 20s, when the memoir ends. I hadn't realized that I'd actually had written a memoir. It was initially all about the food, and that was what linked it. So in a way, the characters at the time seemed less important than what they were eating, what they were smelling, what they were touching. I suppose the book was meant for people who liked food or liked to remember the food of their childhood, rather than people who would read an autobiography.
Well, it does both, doesn't it? Obviously, because somehow in your memories of the food, you've also invested these foods and occasions even with emotional meaning, and they reflect events that are going on in your life. And there's a real story, obviously, a very profound story going on behind your descriptions of the food and what they mean. And that's what gives it such depth, I think. Coming back, Henry, to the narration, though, I mean, this was a single narrator. So did you think, okay, I'm going to put a narrator on stage? How are you going to deal with Nigel's voice?
Yeah, so it started off as about a 4-hour monologue. And amazingly, we had a really, really incredible actor who your listeners will, I'm sure, know, called David Morst, who was playing Nigel during the workshop week. He's got this sort of Alan Bennett-ish lilt to his voice. The way Nigel lovingly described what I had written was a 3-hour Alan Bennett monologue, which was lovely. But the thing that I think that taught me and the rest of the team around us, particularly me and Johnny, was that although Nigel had to be the centre of the show, we had to get him off stage, or at least out of the action, at least once. And that was a really interesting note that we got right from the start. One of the producers on the project said, you know, every single play, you have to get the main character off stage, at least for a little bit, for the audience to have a break and for the audience to start seeing things slightly differently. So that was one thing. And the second thing was, I read an interview with Lee Hall, who did the screenplay for Toast the film. And he said that one of the most important barriers he had to get through was the idea that you had to sort of forget that there was a person called Nigel Slater who was in the room with you. It's a story and you have to tell the story, and you've been given a blessing to tell a story. So don't be scared about what people will think of it. Write the thing you want to write, and then, you know, Nigel can always come back and say, oh, I don't quite like this, or I don't quite like that, as he did. So I think when I had the fear taken away that I wasn't trying to please someone, that I was trying to just write a good play, that's when it started to become a lot less narrative heavy and monologue heavy, and it became a play that included characters that aren't in the book, like the pupils at school, for example.
Well, I think the interesting thing is what results is that you have a narrator of sorts as well. So interwoven seamlessly within the live dialogue, we have Nigel speaking directly to us as well, which is to some degree what happens in the book as well. I mean, essentially, you have a dual perspective going on here, don't you? Because you see the world through Nigel's 9, 10, 11-year-old eyes. And this is really effective because you feel like you're re-inhabiting the 10-year-old's view of the world. But you're also aware that there's Nigel's adult voice behind this. This couldn't be created without it being written by the adult Nigel. It's a play of memory, but you also understand it's a play of knowing. There's an adult understanding of what's going on running behind the 10-year-old boy's narration of what's going on. So Nigel, I'm interested when you were saying at the very beginning about when you're writing a memoir about food, but you're unaware about the other aspects of it. Were you aware of this dual perspective as well? Because you were trying, in a sense, to give the child's view, but you couldn't do that when you're the adult. Were you aware of these two different perspectives running side by side?
I genuinely wasn't. It was, in fact, the very idea that it was a memoir was accidental. It was always meant to be, you know, a piece had been commissioned by the Observer newspaper about the food of my childhood. And I just added a lot of detail about what was happening in my life at the time. And I said, look, you can get rid of all that. I just thought I'd add it because it felt that it introduced the foods. And my editor said, no, I'm keeping every word of it. And it went out as it was, which was quite a shock to me because, as I say, I hadn't really ever intended it to be quite so autobiographical, or indeed quite so intimate. So that side of it, as I say, was always accidental. It was a happy accident because I realized, I suppose, about 3/4 of the way through that there was something else going on. It wasn't just about the food that I grew up with. There was a story that was slowly unfolding. But even when I got to the end of it, I remember thinking that it was more a book about food than about me. It was only when it actually appeared, published, that I realized, yes, this is very autobiographical.
Well, thank goodness for your editor, because they recognized some natural genius was going on here in terms of the way this story was unfolding. I think it's interesting because obviously the child's view of the world gives it such vivid immediacy, but it's also somewhat solipsistic. It's very limited vision of the world. it also feels a bit like a relatively lonely existence. I know from the book that you had brothers, for example. You have two brothers, I believe, older brothers.
Yeah.
They barely appear in the book, and Henry, I don't think they are in the play at all, are they? So it just feels very much like the singular view of Nigel himself. Was that deliberate on your part, Henry?
Yeah, absolutely. There was. Have I got this? I think there was also a dog. Did you have a dog?
I did have a dog.
So
You didn't put the dog on stage.
No, and it's a pity because when everyone was covered in icing sugar during the Christmas cake scene, I'd love to see the dog covered in icing sugar.
It was a conscious decision, and it followed one of our first conversations. Nigel and I spoke, I think, a couple of times on the phone, just around particularly things like the ending, because I was aware that that ending is not how the book ends and it's not how the film ends. So I wanted his blessing that he was okay with that. And the second thing was around getting things out of the book. So what did Nigel want specifically us to be bringing into the audience's mind? And one of the things that really stuck with me was this idea of a little boy who gets ripped out of a very, very safe, secure family unit and dumped in the middle of nowhere on his own, feeling on his own, and without the loving support of two parents who he got on with incredibly well. So also, as well as just thinking expeditiously about character, about numbers of character and things like that, that got me to a point where I felt like we could probably dramatically lose any siblings to really play on that isolation idea, but also to just, I guess, pick up on how sad and heartbreaking that sort of ripping thing was, because it got to me. I went to boarding school, so I resonated with that idea of being ripped out of a safe, secure, warm family unit and thrust into something completely unknown. And you're there with 800 other children, but at the same time you feel completely on your own. So I thought, let's make him completely on his own.
Yeah, well, that is a heartbreaking scenario. In childhood, we're so dependent on the security of our environment, and then to live through those changes. And that's one of the most powerful parts of the whole play and the book, is that this is what's happened to you, Nigel. And the way that this is delivered to us through, again, I'd say, through this kind of dual perspective seems to me makes it even more moving, because you have this where these events are developing through two different lenses. Your childhood view, which is limited, as I've said. And the thing that strikes me is that you very carefully, in the play as well as the book, things are unfolding which you seem not entirely aware of the full import of. But we, as readers or as in the theater, are picking up on. So, for example, your mother's deteriorating health and the real seriousness of that. I mean, you believe somehow they're keeping a secret from you, but that she may be pregnant of all things, which is, of course, we know, we see, we have this terrible knowledge as the audience that this isn't the truth. Was this the way it felt to you at the time? Did you feel, Nigel, excluded, that you didn't know what was going on and this thunderbolt just happened to you?
See, this was the mid-1960s. And not just my family, but it was a general thing that there are things you just kept children protected from. So, for instance, there was no question that I would go to my mother's funeral because you didn't want to subject a 9-year-old boy to seeing a coffin and the rest of it. I mean, my parents never talked about their health, for instance. They never talked about money. These were things that children were excluded from. It was grown-up stuff. Now, that was quite useful for me, writing the book, because there were genuinely things that I didn't really know. In fact, I'm not entirely sure I knew exactly even what my father did. He used to go to these mysterious meetings in the evening, which for the most part were Freemasons meetings, and for a smaller part, I think, was him being a little bit naughty. But all of this was excluded from me. So I had this very protected childhood. And the reason that very important people in my life, such as my brothers and later my stepsisters, were hardly mentioned, there was my dad and mum. My brother had left, both of my brothers had left home. So from a very early age, I was on my own, maybe with the odd invented friend, with the odd pet. I didn't have lots of school friends to play with. unless I'd have fancied a 5-mile walk to go and play with the boy in the nearest farm. So it was a very isolated childhood, and therefore even more protected.
But I think even all children have a relatively limited view of the world and spend, it seems to me, in proportion, even than being an adult, possibly more time inside their own head. And certainly because they have just less experience, less aware what's really happening around them in the world. So their preoccupations are very, very primary. But you're right about that, about maybe a change of age, because I remember in the 60s, the same thing. I was not allowed to go to my grandfather's funeral for the same reason. There's also another interesting effect of the perspective in the play, I think, Henry, because there's a moment at the end of Act 1 when Nigel and his mother are making mince pies. And it's clear, as we've just said, that your mother is becoming increasingly ill. And the dialogue and the narrative perspective are disturbed to the extent that Mum actually jumps out of character and says, "That's not what happened, Nigel. That's not what happened in the script." A meta sort of moment, but it just goes off piste. And it's quite unsettling and it's slightly surprising. What was the intent of this?
I think it was two things for me. The first is that I was really aware that there's one line in the book and in the play that is the only line that gets me every time I watch it or hear it, which is "I hope you die." Yeah. And I was incredibly aware that probably, although we try not to remember those things, probably every child at some point or other has either said or thought that, and how awful it would be if that transpired to happen. I wanted to get, as an audience, into a place where we could hear that line without it being throwaway, because although it is a throwaway line, it's so important, because I felt, and Nigel and I have never really had this conversation before, but I felt like if you were that child, that line would haunt you forever and you would never be able to shake that thing. And I wanted the audience to be there to have that moment with young Nigel, to be there for him and with him. And the only way to do that was to build to that. And unfortunately, because it's such a throwaway line, you don't build to that in real life. You just say it. It just comes out because you're in a terrible mood and you're just in the fit of fury, and your mum hasn't done the thing she said she would do, and how dare she? And we needed, as an audience, to build up to hear that and to then see what would happen next. And the only way to do that was to interrupt the flow of the whole play, because otherwise the whole scene would have been over in 2 minutes and we'd have had to move on as quickly as we got there. So I wanted there to be time. The second thing I wanted was to show, and this is where Johnny did an amazing job on staging it, I wanted to show that Nigel and Mum could have a moment of tenderness before he said that, and before the character set the wheels in motion, if you like. So I wanted there to be a brief pause for us to say, look, we know that this young child doesn't mean the thing he's about to say. Let's acknowledge that, and then we'll go there. So those two things are, I think, why I broke it. Also, I like being relatively playful in storytelling and theatre, and I think it's quite nice to know that you're watching a play, because we are, and we get that. It's not supposed to be real life, and you don't normally dance on a kitchen room table and people move around with you. You don't normally play top of the form in your sweet shop. So I wanted that element to have a tiny bit of theatrical playfulness, but those were the two primary reasons. It was to build and to allow for tenderness before we got there.
Well, I think the line is very striking, as you say. It just leaps out for its starkness and its context, and it's so loaded. But interestingly, as you were speaking, I was thinking it's actually also loaded potentially with some understanding of his subconsciously that something's happening. That may be wrong. It may just at face value, it's fine. But because we as an audience know something serious is happening. But the way the play gets disturbed, as you say, I mean, there is an acknowledgement that Nigel is the narrator, so that it's a play that's delivered via his memory, which can be unreliable. And it's only as he's presenting it to us. And I think also the disruption, I think, serves very effectively to convey the emotional disturbance that's being caused by the trauma of this event. It's like it's too much for him to actually live through again.
I think that's exactly right. I think there was a moment when our first Nigel, Sam Newton, there was a performance very early on in previews at the Lowry where he just lost it. at that point, and he had to be comforted by Lizzie Muncy, who was playing Mum, and that, I think, allowed us as the whole creative team to see that actually what you've just said is right. The character loses control of the narrative at that point, and that was a really important thing to happen.
Nigel, I want to talk to you about your relationship with your mum and dad and how this is presented. But first, I have to go back to the beginning again and to say that in some ways, it still seems to me a completely crazy idea to want to present a play that involves food to such a degree. Now, I know you've talked about Johnny's solutions to this, so I want to know what it is that you did to make sure food was central to the whole thing, to the live performance. Because it always strikes me watching, with all due respect, Nigel, watching cookery on television has this weird thing going on, isn't it? Because we can see all this, but we can't actually eat it. And reading about it, you're just that much more distant again. So how are you going to do this in the theater? We're not actually going to be able to get up there on stage. You're not really cooking, are you? What's going on?
But do you want to go with that, Nigel?
Well, I didn't have any idea, any intention, any thought of bringing real food into it at all. I mean, this was an idea that came from Johnny Reardon and from Henry, and was something that I didn't see how it could work. And also at the time, I was unaware that you actually could cook on stage. The idea of using gas and flame on a stage, I didn't even know that it was allowed. And all of that was, in a practical sense, was sorted by James Thompson, our food director. But because food was really the linchpin of the whole book, because every chapter, almost every chapter, the title was something of food. It was something to eat. It was always named around a dish or a food that I experienced growing up. So the idea that the audience could actually taste something, even if it was only a little sweet or something that they probably hadn't tasted since they were that age, that little boy's age who was on stage. Certainly when packets of sweets were passed around, which was a very interesting thing for me, because I'm the person who glares over my shoulder at somebody who's rustled a sweet wrapper. And suddenly I was being offered sweets, and people were offering them to me and passing them around, and we were all rustling sweet wrappers. And when you've got 400 cellophane packets being opened at the same time, it should be the idea of hell, but actually it was wonderful. Partly because the audience were experiencing something that was going on stage that had been such an important part of my childhood. But also the idea that I genuinely think it added to the whole performance. When the idea was introduced at the beginning, I was absolutely thrilled. I really was.
You're bang on it, because it creates a shared experience, doesn't it? And it breaks down the divide between audience and what's on stage as well. But also literally, of course, it's about food and the actual tasting and appreciation of the food. So one of the things, Henry, you did, I know, is you gave out food, as Nigel says, including, in fact, mini lemon meringue pies. Am I remembering that correctly? That's what I think I got at this theater, which is, wow, that's a bit of a treat.
That was the thing. It was an amazing feat for people to manage to do it. So the Lowry did it originally when it was at the Lowry, and then Lily Vanilli, amazing patisserie chef, cook, cake maker based in the East End, did it for the West End run. And actually, we also did it in Edinburgh.
Yeah, I think I got it at the Traverse as well, yeah.
So we were always going to include food.
Well, one of the great things, as you mentioned, Nigel, is that there is actually some live cooking goes on. And it's, I think, one of the most affecting moments in the play. After your father dies, you make a plate of mushrooms on toast over a live gas hob on the stage. You make this because it was your father's favorite. And what was really, I think, mesmerizing in the theater was you take the entire time to complete this dish on stage. There's no one else on stage, as I remember, and so there's no dialogue spoken. You're just doing this dish. And what also happens is the real aromas of the mushrooms fill the theater. It's a magical sensory theatrical experience and deeply moving as well. Which brings me to a point I wanted to make, which was there's a line in the play when Nigel says that your mom doesn't actually like cooking. She does this for me. And of course, he also says that it's impossible not to love someone who makes you toast. There's a strong belief, I think, underlining the play, and I think from your writing as well, that, and what you've said, that food is love, that you can both give love through making it and receive it through consuming and appreciating it. Would that be true? Do you believe that, Nigel? Does that sound too corny?
It's not corny at all. One of the sadnesses, I suppose, of my childhood was that I knew that my mother didn't really enjoy cooking. I knew it was something I wanted to do. I was fascinated by it, but I was slightly saddened that she didn't enjoy it. But it meant that everything that she did make, particularly treats, little cakes and flapjacks and things, she did purely for me. It was an absolute act of love. It was a token to say, I care about you. There was no other reason. She didn't enjoy doing it. Sometimes she left them in the oven too long and I'd come home to smoke. But he's purely and simply for me. And there's another thing that was very important about the food, and particularly I think about that moment, that very, very long, completely silent scene of Nigel cooking on stage. The fact that food was there, the fact that we were giving the audience something to eat or something to smell was very important to me, because there is what for me is a scary moment in the play. As a member of the audience, very near the end of part one, when I say that line that we were talking about, I hope you die, there is a gasp from the audience. I hear it every single time. There is that moment where I'm sitting there thinking, I have now got to go outside at the interval. Does this audience hate me? Do they hate that boy? It's something that's bothered me every time I see it, that this is somebody who told his mother, I hope you die. I mean, yes, as Henry said, we probably all had that thought at some points, but it was a very brief thought and it went, and we certainly didn't say it, and we certainly didn't say it when they actually were dying. So the idea that we are doing that physical thing of giving people something to eat or something wonderful to smell that's being cooked is so crucial to me, because it's letting the audience know that we love them and we care about them. And I'm not a horrible boy at all. I'm certainly not a horrible grown man because I said that thing.
I don't believe for a single minute that anybody thinks that in the theater, Nigel, if it's any reassurance to you. You're right, it does restore something by, even about in relation to your father, because the relationship that we see with your father in the play is a mixed one. There's a bit of tension there. You fear his mood and his temper, but of course you also crave his love and affection in the rare times when he lets you sit on his lap. So there seems to be a bit of love and hate going on. Sometimes you want nothing to do with him, but you're also desperate, as we all are, for our father's approval. And these are hard things to resolve the balance of. And the cooking of the mushrooms seems to be some kind of resolution for you, some kind of reconciliation with that balance. How did you feel about the approach to representing how you felt about your father?
I coped with the fact that it was such a personal memoir. And I must say that things that I had seen performed by Freddie Highmore on screen, playing Nigel, and then there was always a slight distance. There was always that feeling there's a screen there. And Freddie was wonderful as Nigel. There was so much of Nigel in that performance, but there was always this screen there. And actually being in the audience, sometimes very close to the stage, and having those very personal, very, very intimate moments where I could literally reach out and touch Sam. I could touch Giles Cooper. They were so close, and they were saying those words to the entire audience. It became not just personal, it was illuminated beyond anything I could ever have imagined, because you're always in control of what you say, for instance, in an interview, or if you're writing a piece, I'm in charge. Yeah. There I wasn't. These words were being said, and I was just sitting there, and sometimes in full view of the entire audience. So it took on, it became, on a different level of intimacy, and actually of this slight fear, really, of what are people going to think of this little boy. And although on many occasions, up until about halfway through, I thought of the boy, the character who was on stage, as someone else. Suddenly there would be a bit of stage direction, there would be a bit of body language from Sam or from Giles, or very often from my mum, from Lizzie, that would be, just bring it back to me, this is me. This might be half a century away, but it is me. It's not a separate little boy. And only the stage did that. However much I enjoyed the other genres, the stage one was much more visceral. It got to me.
And did that feel the same way with your mom and dad, who were brought to life? Because you're right, there is a difference between your writing about them and the way you're seeing them as you write them, but then seeing them live in the form of actors, albeit on the stage, being your mom and dad. Did you recognize the reality of your dad and mom in those figures?
Very much so, particularly with mum. It's very odd. I was only slightly involved in the casting, that brutal thing called casting. I was happily not involved in it very much. But seeing little bits of your mum or your dad that you've never really discussed with the actors, it possibly wasn't even in the book, but somehow, maybe through Johnny in directing, maybe through Henry's writing, maybe just through some sort of intuition from the actors, little pieces of mum were really there. Things that I'd never mentioned before. Little pieces of body language from Nigel. Also that constant fear of my dad. Things that I'd actually put away. You know, I'd started to only remember the good bits about my dad. Few that they were, but that's more or less what I'd remembered. But, you know, Stephen brought it all to life on stage in a way I could never, ever.
Well, I think it's there in the original text, and Henry brings this out in the play as well. There is that focus and that love and that dependency that we have as children on our parents. There's such a huge presence in our lives, and it's very nuanced or very complex, shall we say, because there is that tension that you're dependent on them and for security and protection and love. And changes, just minute changes to that, have a huge impact on us, so that we're really sensitive to those things, as I think you are in the play. And you said at the beginning, Henry, those changes when you had to move house or change school, or God forbid, your mother dies, and then another woman comes and occupies your house and is married to your father. It's also a very hard thing to live with you through, Nigel, in the play, and the figure of Joan Potter, who arrives, starting off as the cleaner. I'm not sure whether you knew, again, that was another one of those moments of the dual perspective, where you appear not to have any idea that she's any more than a cleaner for quite a long time.
Well, it's a very, very interesting point, because I didn't know that until after the book was written. And a newspaper, tabloid newspaper, contacted my stepmother's daughters, and they were actually the ones who let me know that there had been something going on that I didn't really know about. You know, I was a very naive little boy, you must remember, a very naive 9-year-old. 9-year-old kids nowadays are very different. So I wouldn't have known anyway. But no, that was a revelation to me that appeared much, much later in life.
Interesting.
That there was anything more than just being a cleaner, but also somebody very, very special. I remember when the cleaner's dog went missing. And I remember my father being so upset. I couldn't understand why he was so upset about this. But obviously, they were in a relationship at the time. And this meant a great deal to her, and therefore, you know, a lot to him. So I genuinely didn't know. I really didn't.
Well, it just makes it all the more difficult for us watching this, you living through this, because there's clearly clues, and we have a knowledge that something more is going on. But it goes back to what you were saying earlier, that a previous generation was much more secretive anyway. They wouldn't have necessarily been involving you. I also enjoyed what you were, we talked earlier about how your mother didn't enjoy cooking, but then Joan, ironically, turns out to be a better cook. But you end up having a sort of battle of one-upmanship in the kitchen. Henry, were you aware that this was somehow psychologically important, this food battle, this cooking battle?
Yeah, and that's exactly what it was. We always shorthanded it when we were discussing it as a food battle. It was supposed to be that sort of an aggressive one-upmanship thing. And actually, the first ever day of the workshop that we did at the Lowry, that formed the basis of the food battle that happened on stage, the leaning and the plates and the scoring of plates against each other. And Psycho Killer as a song was literally the first song that Johnny played That idea of the food battle started on day one, and I think for a lot of people, if it's not the cooking of mushrooms or the dancing on the tables, I think the food battle is one of the things people remember about the play, because it's just such a fun but incredibly odd situation that this little boy would have to fight his stepmother. It's so wrong on so many levels, but funny because of his determination, I guess, to win, and her determination.
I think there's a truth in it, actually. Nigel, I can't imagine Psycho Killer was actually really playing originally. But I do think there is a psychological truth in it, because I think in some ways, Nigel, you must have felt that this was a battleground on which you might have a chance of winning. And there were so many other battlegrounds you weren't. And maybe it was also in some way it was an act of defense of your mom. And, that this space wasn't going to be taken over. Does that make sense?
It does. It was the only battle that I probably stood a chance of winning. Being at school and doing cookery was an enormous point, I suppose, between me and my father, because my father was horrified about the idea that his son was doing cookery at school. It was also unheard of at the time. It was quite a big deal for a headmaster to give permission for a boy to join the girls for cookery. So it became a very, very big thing in our family that instead of doing woodwork or metalwork, this engineer's son was making scones and making fruitcake and bringing it home. So it was big already. So by the time it became a battle, and it really was, it was a war between her and myself. Yes, I suppose in the sense that her Victoria sponge might have been higher than mine or whatever, but it was really a battle about my father's affections and who could get those affections. Also, if my father had turned her out at that point and said, well, actually, this isn't working, she had left her family and her children, and she would have been absolutely sunk. So it was imperative that she stayed in his affections. And part of the way to do that was through cooking, through feeding him. It was the one thing that guaranteed her a job and a place in my father's life. So it wasn't just, I'm going to outdo this boy. It was the hook by which she retained her position in my father's life.
So yeah, food is love again. It's interesting you raise that about the cookery classes at school, because the play also deals with, and I think in a really amusing but also sensitive way, with expectations about masculinity. Through the play, there are these lovely conceits about, for example, that sweets have some sort of gender association, that there are boy sweets and girl sweets. And your father is determined that you should choose boy sweets. And obviously you prefer to be cooking than chopping logs, I think Joan says at one stage, to help your father, and prefer to be making damson jam than kicking a ball. Were you aware of pressure about what the expectations of masculinity were?
Very much so. Both my brothers, although they hadn't gone into my father's engineering business, they both loved sport. They were both quite strong, physically strong kids. And I wanted nothing to do with sport at all. Woodwork, the end for me, was the ghastly coffee table I had to make at school, which was so amateur. It was awful. And my father insisted on putting it in the middle of the living room. And it sat there for 2 years, haunting me, these dreadful dovetailed joints and this wonky top. But he was, I think, trying to say, we'll love you if you do this. No matter what the result is, we will love you. But I was having none of it. Yes, I know that my father would have been happier with a boy who liked sport and who was physically strong, because I was quite a skinny, weak little lad. And he certainly would have been happy with a boy who didn't do cookery. And he was frightening. So when he made a decision, he must be obeyed. And I had disobeyed everything. I disappointed him, but I carried on doing what I wanted to do, even then. I'm going to do this thing that he regarded as being very feminine, and that is make cakes. He never set foot inside a professional kitchen. He didn't know that they were mostly staffed by men. He just thought cooking was woman's work. And his son was doing it. In much the same way as when I was working at the Talbot, the husband of the cook who I got to work with, he denied that his son was at ballet school. He said he was at drama school. because he couldn't bear the idea his son was a ballet dancer.
Yeah. Well, it took courage to follow your own path. I think nostalgia is a powerful sauce. And you talked at the very beginning, Nigel, about the book being your loving memories of the foods from your childhood. How do you think, Henry, that nostalgia works in relation to writing the play?
Well, I think there's two things I would say. The first is that obviously I grew up in a slightly different generation. So the stories and the memories that Nigel was writing about weren't the exact same stories and memories for me growing up. But I think one of the most important things is that about the play, and I think the reason why it has been enjoyed by so many people right across the different age spectrums is because everyone has had some sort of an experience, like hating eggs and having to deal with that, or like loving a butterscotch angel delight, because those things still exist, and everyone has had that joy of a sherbet fountain. So I think nostalgia is, for me at least, nostalgia is something that I was very much dissuaded from by the Lowry. Julia Fawcett, who's the chief executive there, the steer she gave me was that she didn't want it to be some sort of rose-tinted, sickly sweet sort of celebration of time gone by. It shouldn't be that. And that's something that I tried to steer clear of. That said, everyone can immediately bring to mind what it smells like when you can smell burning toast. We all know what happens when you try and get butter out of a plastic container which burned bits of toast on it. We've all had those black bits in toast. We all know how to lick out a walnut whip. We've all been there. We've all done those sorts of things. So actually, it was less about the nostalgia for me, certainly, and it was more about the shared experiences that we have all had to do with food.
Yeah, so I think underlying it, what is universal is there's an association between food and memory, or between food and an emotional state. It's one of the foundation stones of the play, and it's basically like Proust and his Madeleine. Digestive biscuits in the play taste of home, making mince pies or the Christmas cake. For Nigel, it's a direct connection to your mum. And we all have those associations. They may be slightly different by label or brand, because I have to say that I, coming from Canada, didn't recognize most of the things you were actually describing. And I can't say that I'm too sorry to have missed some of them, to be honest. But I also think that those memories of the ordinary things and events of our lives, the routines, that are the foundation and glue for us in our security, our identity, having Sunday lunch together, the family holiday, Christmas, whatever those routines that become family rituals are, those are our foundation. That's why we relate to this. It feels universal. I read a review somewhere that talked about how in the play and the book you describe events and objects that a middle-class childhood in Britain would recognize and are commonplace to many. And so, of course, there's that kind of attraction, that universality. But I also read a quote only yesterday that seemed appropriate to, I think, what Toast does. And it said how the job of art is to give the mundane its beautiful due. It's the ordinary things that you've somehow brought out and given emotional resonance to. Were you conscious that there was, these lists of things that you ate and stuff would have this kind of power?
I suppose I thought that they were all very personal, and that I was probably the only person who could remember half of the sweets and things that were there. What I hadn't realized was that so many other people had loved those sweeties and things as a child, and that they had, although different memories, they had memories attached to them all, which is illuminated really, I suppose, when we passed the sweeties round in the theatre, and you could see people picking up something that they hadn't actually tasted for 40 years. And wham, all those memories came with it. When Toast was finally published as a book, I do remember getting letters to say that, yes, I'd forgotten about those treats and those little sweets and things. And your book brought back all those memories. They were very mundane things, and yet they had very special memories for everybody. I wasn't aware of it at the time because they just did seem mundane, but they weren't just my memories. They were going to be for other people too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the play, although, it sounds like a contradiction in terms of the play, for me, the play, although food has a starring role is not really about food. For me, it's about the relationship between a boy and his mum. And that is the most mundane and important and beautiful relationship that exists on the planet. So if that's the mundanity that we're looking at, I'm really happy with that.
Yeah, well, it's clearly not just a play about those memories of food. It's obviously full of these emotional resonances and really life-changing events that we see through the child's eyes that are associated by food and memory. When you were talking earlier about the challenges you faced as a child, Nigel, and how, you had the courage to get through them, there are a couple of lines that jumped out in the play that seemed somehow almost aphorisms for the personal story that's told of you becoming a person and a cook. Both of these are statements that you give to other characters to say, but which to me, as I say, are as much about you, Nigel. First, Doreen, the owner and chef in the local kitchen, says, "Be careful of recipes. I'm not interested in someone else's tastes." And then your mother expresses a similar view. She says, "Recipes are just someone else telling you what they like." So this is interesting, the use of the word recipe, because of course you've spent your life making these recipes. But I think the first is an exhortation not to follow anyone else's map or plan for what you should be. And the twist maybe on the second is that, Nigel, in your writing, you've simply been telling us what you like. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes, it is. I've always sort of plowed my own furrow when it comes to recipes. I've never really particularly been inspired by the people I think you're supposed to be inspired by as a cookery writer. I've just written about what I like. But I've also made very clear that my recipes aren't there to be followed to the letter. They are there to inspire. And if you want to pick up a little bit of the method and some of the ingredients and then add or leave something out, then I'm just as thrilled. And those early words from Doreen, they've stayed with me to this day, really. I mean, it's almost as if I based my whole career on that sentence,
Yes.
That it's certain things are expected in cookery writing, in recipe writing, most of which I've just ignored and just carried on. And the other point you made earlier about young Nigel, when I watched Giles and Sam on stage playing Nigel, I realised how steely that little boy actually was, because I was terrified of my dad, absolutely petrified of him, and I was anxious to please my mother, but I still did what I wanted to do. And I am still shocked watching every performance, just that tiny little boy who was very polite and very shy still did what he wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's inspiration to us all. Before we bring the curtain down, there are just two brief things I'd like to do. First, I'd like to remind everyone that there is still time to catch the online dramatization of Nigel Slater's Toast, which runs until the 31st of July. Henry, how would you describe what the online play is?
I think it's a radio play with animation, I think is how I describe it. So you can listen to it and you'll get something from it, I hope, but equally you can watch it. It's a series of watercolours and beautiful renderings of bits of the story that go really well to complement the audio play.
Yeah, so I listened to it when it first came out, and I thought it was enhanced beautifully by the watercolors. You can access the online play by logging on to the website of the Lawrence Batley Theatre, or just Google it to find the link. When you book a ticket, in addition to the show, you will also be sent a program, a recipe card from Nigel, and the best bit of all, I believe, is this right? 2 actual walnut whips, so you can have a full multi-sensory experience. Is that right?
It is right, although we're really, really running low on walnut whips, so that option will go very shortly. But otherwise, you'll still get the recipe cards and the link to the play.
Oh, that's great that it's so popular. If you book, you're also helping the theatre to ride out the coronavirus crisis, of course. Secondly, one of the traditions of the Play podcast is that I'd like to ask our guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. Now, Henry, you're the theatre man. I know when live theatre is not going on at the moment, it's harder to bring to mind a show that has made a great impression, but I'm sure you have a personal favorite that you could suggest.
Yeah, mine's easy. It would either be Things I Know to Be True, which is on digital theatre at the moment, or it would be The Inheritance. I saw it twice last year, and it's without doubt the best play I've ever seen.
Thank you for that. Henry and Nigel, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been special. There's lots more we could talk about, but I really enjoyed what we have done. The curtain falls, in Nigel Slater's toast, on a young man who is set off to make his way in the world. Despite, or perhaps because of, the profound emotional and practical challenges he has faced in his childhood, he's had the courage to follow his own recipe in life. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.